To these grievous measures, Americans cannot submit. That was the bold declaration in late 1774 that helped spark colonial resistance, a coordinated one really for the first time. And on this episode, commemorating the 250th anniversary of passage of the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress, we're going to dive into what turned out to be not only a precursor to the Declaration of Independence, but also the Bill of Rights years later, too, and also the essential revolutionary principle that acts beyond the Constitution are usurpations of power and void and should be rejected, resisted, and nullified where they belong into oblivion. On this episode, I've got a little bit of essential background on this. There's also some influence from Thomas Jefferson in Virginia, Dr. Joseph Warren in Massachusetts. I'll have highlights from the Declaration itself and maybe a little bit more. But first of all, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, October 14th, 2024. And let's kick it off here with the first line from the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress, passed today in history, October 14th, 1774. And they start with this: whereas since the close of the last war, this is talking about the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War that ended in 1763, the British Parliament claiming a power of right to bind the people of America by statute in all cases whatsoever, hath in some acts expressly imposed taxes on them, and in others under various pretenses, but in fact for the purpose of raising a revenue, hath imposed rates and duties payable in these colonies, established a board of commissioners with unconstitutional powers, and extended the jurisdiction of courts of admiralty, not only for collecting the said duties, but for the trial of causes merely arising within the body of a county. They go on and on and on. This is in reference, in case you're not familiar with it, if you're new here, maybe you've never heard of this, but the Declaratory Act of 1766, which was passed as kind of a backhanded compliment when the colonists resisted the Stamp Act in 1765. They made it basically unenforceable in many places. And so when the British Parliament decided to repeal it, at the same time they passed this thing called the Declaratory Act, which claimed power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. And so many times we hear people say that the revolution was only about taxation without representation or standing armies or regulations or maybe duties, etc., internal revenue raising claims. But really, those were all outgrowths of this claim of British power in all cases whatsoever. Going further, they had this Declaration of 10 rights, kind of a precursor, like I said, to the Bill of Rights, which included life, liberty, and property, the right to peaceably assemble, and a bunch more that I'm going to cover a little bit later in the episode. It also had a list of grievances, which is like a precursor to the Declaration of Independence, which included depriving Americans of the right to trial by jury, establishing standing armies. And it especially took issue with the Coercive Acts, what many people today call the Intolerable Acts. This was a series of acts passed, I think it was from March through around June of 1774 by the British Parliament, primarily to punish the people of Massachusetts, but also to establish authority to make sure no one else got out of hand than just the people in Boston. This was to punish them for the Tea Party in late 1773. And here they reference specifically the first of the Coercive Acts. They say, in the last session of Parliament, 3 statutes were made. One entitled, An Act to discontinue in such manner and for such time as are therein mentioned the landing and discharging, lading or shipping of goods, wares, and merchandise at the town and within the harbor of Boston in the province of Massachusetts Bay in North America. And that, of course, is a reference to the Boston Port Act. And here from history.com, they point out that on March 31st, 1774, that's when Britain passed the Port Act. It closed the port of Boston and demanded that the city's residents pay for the nearly $1 million worth in, well, today's money. It's probably much more since this was written, because we know they keep depreciating the currency or the fiat funny money so quickly. So they wanted them to not only, it was a collective punishment. Basically, these people we saw did something wrong, and therefore we're going to shut down the entire port until the whole city forces people to cough things up. You can't be more, I guess, pre-commie, but commie than that. So $1 million worth of tea dumped in the harbor during the Boston Tea Party of December 16, 1773. And here from George Washington's Mount Vernon estate, they point out that King George III gave the act a royal assent on May 20th. So it was passed on March 31st. The act authorized the Royal Navy to blockade Boston Harbor because, quote, the commerce of His Majesty's subjects cannot be safely carried on there. The blockade commenced on June 1st, 1774, effectively closing Boston's port to commercial traffic. It was pretty crippling, and that was just no joke. And of course, you have this really powerful imperial navy enforcing it as well. Additionally, they write, it forbade any exports to foreign ports or provinces. The only imports allowed were provisions for the British Army. So basically, rules for you, but not for us. We're going to close this down, but we're going to continue doing what we do. And that's what they do during all government shutdowns these days as well. They shut down a few things, but the surveillance state never stops. The gun control, the empire, none of that ever seems to stop. Anyway, so they shut down all imports except unless it was for the government and necessary goods such as fuel and wheat. So they had kind of a list of emergency items, what we saw during shutdown here as well. Now, news of the port bill reached Boston or the colonies really around May 10th or 11th of 1774, even before the king gave it royal assent, but it was going to happen. It was passed. And Joseph Warren, Patriot Dr. Joseph Warren, was named to a town meeting committee to basically recommend a responsive action from the people of Boston, and maybe should they recommend other people take action as well. Samuel Adams was named as the moderator, and they passed this resolution in a Boston town meeting on May 13th, 1774, voted that it is the opinion of this town that if the other colonies come into a joint resolution to stop all importation from Great Britain and exportations to Great Britain and every part of the West Indies till the act for blocking up this harbor be repealed, the same will prove the salvation of North America and her liberties. The viewpoint from the old revolutionaries, again, an act against the Constitution is void. And it doesn't just get void by saying so. As Samuel Adams put it just a few years earlier in 1771, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. So when government goes beyond its limits, you have to recognize that, first of all, government is going beyond its limits, and then you have to do stuff to defend it. And just sitting there, standing there, doing nothing, complying, allowing government to do what it does, and then begging government to stop doing what it shouldn't have been doing in the first place is not defending freedom as it ought. I don't know how else to put that, but that's as straightforward as possible. So they're saying, like, look, if they're going to do this, we have to economically cripple them because they are very rich because of the trade here in the colonies. Anyways, they go further. On the other hand, if they continue their exports and imports, there is high reason to fear that fraud, power, and the most odious oppression will rise triumphant over right, justice, social happiness, and freedom. That's primarily drafted by Dr. Joseph Warren, Samuel Adams, and others involved as well. So the very following day, we all hear of Paul Revere's ride in 1774, but Paul Revere made a bunch of very important rides around New England and elsewhere. We've got two of them on this episode. So the very next day, I think, so this would have been May 14th, they dispatched Paul Revere to take the resolution to a number of committees of correspondence as far as he could get. We know that it got to the New York Committee of Correspondence pretty quickly because they responded as well. And this is how they put it. This is May 23rd, 1774. As a sister colony suffering in defense of the rights of America, we consider your injuries as a common cause to the redress of which it is equally our duty and our interest to contribute. So they referred to these as alarming measures. Again, this is still only in reference to the Boston Port Bill. They added a few more of these so-called intolerable or coercive acts. In the meantime, it took you couldn't text it to somebody. Hey, check out this new PDF of this legislation that they're considering in Parliament. No, it took quite some time. They passed it on, it was in March 25th or March 31st, and then it didn't get to the colonies until the 10th or 11th of May, and then they immediately, you could see how quickly they went to action on this. It was just the communication time that slowed things down a bit. So New York, the Committee of Correspondence, they send this back to the Committee of Correspondence in Boston. They say, we conclude that a Congress of Deputies from the colonies in general is of the utmost moment that it ought to be assembled without delay, and some unanimous resolutions formed in this fatal emergency, not only respecting your deplorable circumstances, but for the security of our common rights. So Boston is saying, we think we need to have an immediate non-importation, non-exportation. We need to do an economic boycott of Britain and the West Indies. New York said, we like the idea, but we're not going to take action on this immediately. But what we should do is have a Congress. We should all meet together and see if we can come to some kind of unanimous decision. And so New York started sending this, the Committee of Correspondence started sending their view out, saying, let's have a Congress to a bunch of other people. One of the members of that Committee of 51 in that Committee of Correspondence was John Jay, who later became the first Chief Justice. And he put it like this in a letter to John Vardill. He said, I returned from the northern counties yesterday and found myself one of the committee appointed by the city to take into consideration the measures of Parliament relative to Boston and consult upon the most effectual methods to advance the interest of the common cause. We sat 4 hours, I don't know what P-Day is, and have agreed to attempt a Congress of Deputies from all the colonies. This is calling the First Continental Congress. There was a Stamp Act Congress that was only attended by 9 of the colonies, but I think some of the people discussing this, at least from the way I've read it, they saw that as an effective measure, and they're like, let's try that again, but let's go a little bit bigger, see if we can get them all together and get unanimous action in response to these so-called coercive acts. So we have agreed to attempt a Congress of Deputies from all the colonies as the most probable means of effecting a general union and consistency of councils, 4 of which number I am one, are appointed to prepare dispatches for Boston. And so by July of 1774, 12 of the colonies were on board and picking delegates to what they were calling a Grand Continental Congress to meet ended up picking a date of September 5th at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. Only Georgia did not send delegates. I've seen conflicting reasons as to why, but we'll save that for something else. And it really was not something easy to get to, especially at that time of year. And especially with the transportation technology of the time. I think George Washington took like 5 days to get to Philadelphia from where he was. John Adams and the Massachusetts delegation, it normally would have taken 10 or 11, but they took like 19 or 20 days. They made it kind of a trip and a tour. I guess that kind of fits John Adams's approach. And in the meantime, there was all kinds of conversation going on. And I think some really interesting stuff that maybe is very relevant for us today on what should be discussed in the Congress, what kind of strategies they should take. Here's a letter from a very important, but almost completely ignored, even on this show until today, important revolutionary mind, a leader of the Sons of Liberty in Boston. Joseph Hawley sent this to John Adams. He said, "It appears to me, sir, that the Congress ought first to settle with absolute precision the object or objects to be pursued, as whether the end of all shall be the repeal of the tea duty only, or that and the molasses duty, or them and opening the port of Boston, or them and also the restoration of the Charter of Massachusetts Bay." So now we're getting to the Massachusetts Government Act where they were shutting down the legislature in Massachusetts. That's one of the coercive acts, the intolerable acts. And he's saying, like, look, are we just going to address the Tea Act, or do we need to look at these other things? Molasses, Sugar Act, open the port, stop everything. He said, you are pleased to say, and John Adams had written to him, like, well, you don't want to get too extreme. We often think of John Adams as the hothead, the guy who was really pushing for independence before many others. But Before him, it was Abigail Adams, his wife, who was pushing him. Hey, there's a lot of talk here, but no action. On people like Joseph Hawley, who was really saying, we got to move forward. I've got a juicy one from him that Adams shared with Patrick Henry here in just a moment as well. He said, you are pleased to say that extremities and ruptures, it is our policy to avoid. So he's just saying, so John Adams had written to Hawley and said, we got to make sure that this doesn't get too crazy at this point. He said, I agree if any other means will answer our ends, or if it is plain that they would not. So Hawley's saying like, oh, we don't want to have an extremity or a rupture. Basically, are we going to fight or not? He said, I would like to avoid it if we can get the results we need without fighting, or if fighting would be a bad choice strategically. So he was only talking about battling the British in terms of whether or not it would be effective, not right or wrong, kind of a blanket moral approach. He said, but let me say, sir, that with me, it is settled as a maxim and first truth that the people or state who will not or cannot defend their liberties and rights will not have any for any long time. They will be slaves. Some other state will find it out and will subjugate them. Use it or lose it. That's the mentality on liberty that someone like Joseph Hawley, I would say Samuel Adams, Dr. Joseph Warren, of course, Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, and many others would have taken at the time that so few people take today. It's like, oh, I don't want to stick my neck out. Thomas Jefferson once said, timid men prefer the calm of despotism to the tempestuous sea of liberty. That's just off the top of my head, so I may have misquoted it. But basically, it's the timid people who don't want to take a stand because they're afraid of what the results are. That doesn't mean you have to be, again, we have smart strategy here. Some people want to get into a big shoot 'em up right off the bat. And he's even saying, here's Joseph Hawley, one here in July of 1774, supposedly well before anybody's really talking about a war for independence, fighting back against the British. He's saying, like, look, we should consider this, but we have to think about it strategically. We don't want to just be dumb and charge into something and then lose, because we have a goal to achieve, and that is protecting and defending our liberty against the largest government in the history of the world, which is what we're facing once again. Then we also have Thomas Jefferson. So Joseph Hawley had some influence here. Thomas Jefferson, in July, he was drafting a set of proposed instructions for the Virginia delegates to the First Continental Congress. He not only included, and I covered this in another episode, I'll get to that in a moment, he not only had this long, detailed set of grievances, and I mentioned in that other episode that this is kind of one of the main reasons why he was chosen as a lead guy for drafting the Declaration of Independence, because he had already written a precursor to it. So he wrote this thing, a long, detailed list of grievances, usurpations of power by both Parliament and the king, but he also included this juicy piece. He said, we do not point out to his majesty the injustice of these acts with intent to rest on that principle the cause of their nullity. So we're saying these things are null and void, but we're not saying they're null and void because they're bad policy. Instead, we're saying they're null and void because you have no authority to do this stuff in the first place, whether it's good policy or not. And Jefferson goes on, probably better flair than I have. He said, but instead, to show that experience confirms the propriety of those political principles which exempt us from the jurisdiction of the British Parliament. So, much stronger than John Adams up in Massachusetts, Thomas Jefferson took the position that Parliament had no authority, external or internal, to regulate anything. He said, the true ground on which we declare these acts void is that the British Parliament has no right to exercise authority over us. Period. At all. I covered this in much more detail in an episode, one of my favorite ones recently, Null and Void, Thomas Jefferson's 1774 Radical Declaration. We've got a long project that we're working on here, Mike Meharry and I, because we look at 1774 as the ultimate year of strategy for the old revolutionaries. So there's so much to cover on that, but this is one important piece. The summary view of the rights of British America, that was Jefferson's declaration that was printed and shared all over the place. Very, very influential. That'll be linked to in the show notes. Make sure you check that one out as well. Now, here's Joseph Hawley again. This is known today as the Broken Hints Letter. Basically, some suggestions that he sent to John Adams, again, in August of 1774. We don't know the exact date, but here's how he put it. We must fight. If we can't rid ourselves of British taxation, all revenues, and the constitution or form of government enacted for us by the British Parliament. It is evil against right, utterly intolerable to every man who has any idea or feeling of right or liberty. Now, I'm not sure what kind of changed his tune to be even more aggressive. I can only assume that Hawley was being further informed of what the British were doing in Parliament, and as news came of more and more intolerable acts, utterly intolerable, shutting down the legislature, the Boston Port Act, of course, the Quartering Act, etc. It is evil against right. So we must fight, is how he started it. And that's what he's sending to John Adams, because John Adams is the one who's going to the Continental Congress. Hawley couldn't go because of it was a smallpox thing going on, and he had not been inoculated, so they thought he wasn't safe to be there for health reasons. But anyways, he said, it is now or never that we must assert our liberty. 20 years will make the number of Tories on this continent equal to the number of Whigs, Tories being the British, Whigs being the Patriots. 20 years. In 20 years' time, if we don't take action now, we are going to be overwhelmed and outnumbered. He said, they who shall be born will not have any idea of a free government. And maybe that's an oxymoron, but that's a different story. John Adams kind of recalled getting this in a letter to William Wirt, who wrote this great book on Patrick Henry that was very famous in the early part of the 19th century. Here's John Adams discussing this. He said, the letter I read to Mr. Henry. So he went to the First Continental Congress, and this was actually at the end of the First Continental Congress, but John Adams read it to Mr. Henry. He said, who listened to it with great attention. And as soon as I had pronounced the words, after all, we must fight, he erected his head, and with an energy and vehemence that I can never forget, broke out with, by God, I am of that man's mind. I put the letter into his hand, wrote Adams, and when he had read it, he returned to me with an equally solemn asseveration that he agreed entirely in the opinion with the writer. So Patrick Henry was pumped at this point. This is sometime in later October 1774, and he's like, yes, we are going to have to come to arms against the British. Now, I'm mentioning a bunch of source documents here, other articles and episodes and things like that. If you're wondering, hey, Bolden, where can I find that letter from John Adams to William Wirt? Or where can I find Joseph Hawley's Broken Hints, etc.? Those will all be included in a blog post for this episode in the show notes section. We publish one for every single episode. We've been doing this for a number of years now. Alan Mosley organizes the blog post, and for each episode, if you scroll down at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, you can see just an overview of the episode. Then you have an audio player, a video player, and then you have a show links section, so you can say, okay, that I want to check that out. I want to read it in context and learn more on my own time. I want to check out that episode on Thomas Jefferson's 1774 summary view of the rights of British America. Where is that? So that'll be over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Once Alan gets that organized, I'll get it published a couple of hours after the live stream is done. And while I'm here, I want to take a quick moment and say hello to everyone out in the live chat. I really appreciate you guys being here. There's Charles and Melody and Kirk, Brewster, Haji, Senator DT, Dixie Strong, a bunch of names I recognize, Howard Clegg. I appreciate you guys being here. A few new people. This is a public service. White-bearded Gnu, good to see you as well. I know I'm scrolling through this pretty quickly, and I don't want to spend too much time on the chat here today because I got a lot more information to go through, and I really appreciate you being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. But let's get back to it. So the First Continental Congress kicks off on September 5th, I believe, 1774. Again, 250-year anniversary. I've not seen too many people discussing this stuff, maybe some history geeks here and there, but this is important foundational stuff that, of course, they're skipping over because the government-run schools never teach us this stuff. No one thinks about, well, what happened in 74 was the ramp up to the entire resistance. Now, in the First Continental Congress, we think of like the time around the War for Independence and the kind of the height of the American Revolution. There was all kinds of unity towards resisting the British, and they were all on board with the same foundational principles, but that is absurdly wrong at the time. Even from these colonies, the lead representatives from these various colonies, Patrick Henry to John Adams and Samuel Adams and many others, they had widely different viewpoints. They weren't even united on the simplest things. So as soon as they get there on the 5th, there's a debate over how to even count the votes. And Patrick Henry kicked it off with this. He said, it would be a great injustice if a little colony should have the same weight in the councils of America as a great one. And therefore, he was for a committee. So they wanted to figure out how they were going to organize the votes. Patrick Henry did not think it should be one state or one colony, one vote. He wanted them weighted. Of course, Virginia was big and powerful, and maybe he wanted to see influence there. John Sullivan, Major John Sullivan, in New Hampshire, of course, the small one, said a little colony had its all at stake as well as a great one. So we are uniting here in the Grand Continental Congress as representatives of each colony. This isn't like one giant government with equal representation. He said so John Adams went into a long speech. He said, this is a question of great importance. If we vote by colonies, this method will be liable to great inequality and injustice, for 5 small colonies with 100,000 people in each may outvote 4 large ones, each of which had 500,000 inhabitants. So you see people like John Sullivan of New Hampshire really pushing for a pure kind of confederation or federal type of approach on this. There was also a big debate. I just thought that was really interesting to point out because there was not unanimity. There was not total agreement on all these things. And also opening with a prayer came in with a big debate as well. You'd think these are generally all of Christian faith and they had their approach to things and they'd be all cool with each other. But no. The different sects created a big division. And here's John Adams writing to Abigail Adams about this. He said, Mr. Cushing made a motion that it should be opened with prayer. It was opposed by Mr. Jay of New York, so John Jay of New York, and John Rutledge of South Carolina, because we were so divided in religious sentiments. Some Episcopalians, some Quakers, usually Pennsylvania, some Anabaptists, I'm not familiar with that one, some Presbyterians, some Congregationalists, of course, that's a lot in Virginia, so that we could not join in the same act of worship. So they're debating, they're spending all this time, just what they do, debating. A lot of times they get distracted from the task at hand. Maybe this was a distraction as well. So Samuel Adams comes to the rescue. He arose and said he was no bigot and could hear a prayer from a gentleman of piety and virtue who was at the same time a friend to his country. So he's basically saying like, let's roll with this. I'll listen to whoever, as long as they're a good person, they're honest, and their goal is to be a friend to these united now colonies. So the next morning or so, maybe it was 2 days later, a minister from Philly opened with a prayer. But September 6th is where the fireworks really start kicking in. There's notice of a big British attack in Boston. John Adams in his diary says, went to Congress again, received by an express an intimation of the bombardment of Boston. This is according to what they're receiving, around September 1st. So 5 days later or so, he said, a confused account, but an alarming one indeed. God grant it may not be found true. So he's not 100% sure it happened. Robert Treat Payne, in his diary, he said about 2 o'clock, a letter came from Israel Putnam into town, forwarded by expresses in about 70 hours from Boston, by which we were informed that the soldiers had fired on the people and town at Boston. So once they convened later in the day, they're all freaking out. And Patrick Henry opens that up in the evening. He said, government is dissolved. This is, okay, we're fully at war at this point. Fleets and armies and the present state of things show that government is dissolved. The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American. Now, this is not Patrick Henry rejecting the idea that his allegiance, of course, was to his country of Virginia, but he's recognizing, he's making the case in the context here, at least this is how I'm reading it. He's making the case that nothing's happened to us here in Virginia. It is our compatriots, our friends, our neighbors, our brothers and sisters in Boston that are under attack. So we're just as much them as they are us. We all have to come to the aid of each other against the empire. And so that was Patrick Henry. But it turns out that this was a false alarm. We call it today the powder alarm, but it really shows how the Patriots were ready to fight in self-defense. I covered this in some detail in an episode last year. That'll be linked to in the show notes. The episode is It Was Gun Control, the Powder Alarm and the Road to Independence. So on September 7th, Congress then established two committees, and this is from carpentershall.org, established two committees to recommend action on areas of dispute with Britain. So 2 delegates from each colony were appointed to a committee to define colonial rights. So this is this declaration or Bill of Rights that they came up with, 10 of them, and how Parliament and the King had infringed upon them. A second committee comprising 1 delegate per colony was charged with specifying how acts of Parliament had seriously affected the colonial economy. Consequently, daily sessions of Congress had to be suspended. Basically, everybody was on one or the other committee. I think George Washington was one of the few that was on neither. But in the meantime, back in Boston, Dr. Joseph Warren, once again, very important figure throughout 1774, and then once he was killed at the Battle of Bunker Hill in 75, but very important Revolutionary War hero, he led the charge for the passage of what we today call the Suffolk Resolves, which were September 9th, 1774. They were called for a boycott of British imports, so they were again pushing this economic embargo on the British. Non-compliance, so active non-compliance to all the Coercive Acts, even disobedience to the courts. He called for tax resistance. It passed unanimously. The very next day, once again, Paul Revere, in another one of his less famous rides, he rode from Boston to Philadelphia with a copy of these Suffolk Resolves, arrived on September 16th, brought it to the First Continental Congress. Everybody's like, okay, Revere's here. What's he have to say? This must be important stuff. Let's check it out. And so here we go. The Saturday morning session began at 9 o'clock with President Randolph, I think it was Peyton Randolph, reading aloud in a calm voice as possible the 19 paragraphs and concluding message to General Gage. These are the Suffolk Resolves from Dr. Joseph Warren and the Boston Town Committee under his leadership. The resolves mince no words. Arbitrary will, military executioners, murderous law, villains, our enemies. These are some of the phrases that were used. They write, further, the resolved urged Suffolk communities to raise a militia to learn the arts of war. Specifically, they're saying, let's raise a militia. We have to be ready to fight. The intolerable acts passed by Congress were gross infractions, and as a parting shot, the resolves called for an embargo on British goods, in effect closing British ports in retaliation for closing the port of Boston. Now, they didn't mention here the tax resistance and the defiance of the courts and the non-compliance, but it called for all of that. They read it all. And then they passed it unanimously. This is how they describe it. Everyone listened attentively until the end. Then wild applause from most, but not all the delegates. Joseph Galloway shouted over the din, quote, "For Congress to countenance such a statement is tantamount to a complete declaration of war." He was right, they write. Well, in their opinion, he was right. But few were in a mood to listen. Congress adopted the resolves by a unanimous vote, at least according to the record. And I think that's important to point that out because there were some of the so-called conservatives, Galloway, who was proposing a plan of union where there would be an annual Congress with a presiding officer, like a general president that was appointed by the king to be the representative of Congress in America. So not everybody was fully on board on this, but it did pass unanimously, at least in the record. John Adams was really happy about this. He included this in his diary. "This was one of the happiest days of my life. In Congress, we had generous, noble sentiments and manly eloquence. This day convinced me that America will support the Massachusetts or perish with you." So now we get to this Declaration of Rights, this Bill of Precursor to the Bill of Rights. in the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress. They say, the inhabitants of the English colonies in North America, by the immutable laws of nature, the principles of the English Constitution, and the several charters or compacts, have the following rights. So again, they're first citing natural law. And there was some debate about this in the Congress. Should we cite natural law or should we just look to the Constitution and the laws? So they say basically all of it. These are our rights based on these principles. First, natural, immutable laws of nature. Doesn't matter what government says, we still have these rights. Plus, these long-standing principles and traditions that we get from the English Constitution, our charters and compacts of our various colonies, etc. And the first one is this. They are entitled to life, liberty, and property, and they have never ceded to any sovereign power whatever a right to dispose of either without their consent. The next two then asserted the rights of their ancestors who emigrated to America, similar to what Thomas Jefferson wrote about in his summary view. Excuse me. And then the fourth one was authored by John Adams. He said, the foundation of English liberty and of all free government is a right in the people to participate in their legislative council. This is the no taxation without representation argument. He said, and as the English colonists are not represented from their local and other circumstances, cannot be properly represented in the British Parliament. They are entitled to a free and exclusive power of legislation in their several provincial legislatures, where their right of representation can alone be preserved in all cases of taxation and internal polity, subject only to the negative of their sovereign in such manner as been heretofore used and accustomed. So if we're not going to be represented there, then the only people who can represent us are the people in our colonies. And that was the position of John Adams as well. And then numbers 8 through 10, of course, you can read through the whole thing on your own. They have a right to peaceably assemble. This is a precursor to part of the First Amendment. Consider of their grievances and petition the king, and that all prosecutions, prohibitory proclamations, and commitments for the same are illegal. So if they say you can't assemble, you can't petition, you can't share your grievances, this is a right to free speech and assembly and petition. This is all very early First Amendment stuff. And anything that tries to stop that is illegal. Doesn't matter what you say. We are calling it illegal. That's very similar. Although they didn't go with Jefferson's instructions in summary view, they're still saying these are a nullity. They're void. Number 9 is keeping a standing army in these colonies in times of peace without the consent of the legislature of the colony in which such army is kept is against the law. And then they talk about separation of powers. The exercise of legislative power in several colonies by a council appointed during pleasure by the crown is unconstitutional, dangerous, and destruction to the freedom of American legislation. So if we can't have our own legislature, you can't just put whoever you want. You're the sovereign king, and it's like you're representing yourself. That's not cool whatsoever. And then they get to this list of grievances. And they start out with this because there was some debate over what to include. They say, in the course of our inquiry, we find many infringements and violations of the foregoing rights, which from an ardent desire that harmony and mutual intercourse of affection and interest may be restored, we pass over at the present, or for the present, and proceed to state such acts and measures as have been adopted since the last war, which demonstrate a system formed to enslave America. So Thomas Jefferson, in his summary view of the rights of British America, he went through this whole list of stuff going back to 1651, the Navigation Acts. He talked about the Hat Act, the Iron Act of 1750, all kinds of stuff that we never learn about. We never talk about. The Hat Act, he thought, was the grossest, most total form of despotism, saying that you couldn't, basically kill game on your own property and make a hat out of it. You had to ship it back, basically. Or was that the Iron Act? I get some of these confused. But he said this is a form of despotism. If you're getting down to someone's home and their property and telling what they can do in their own home, this is insane. So there was some debate over this. And some people were basically saying, oh, if we go through all the stuff that Jefferson wanted, and they didn't say him specifically, but if we list all this stuff going back a full century, we're going to turn the entire British population against us. We still want some friendly response to this. There is some hope from people like Richard Henry Lee, who was in agreement that they were all unconstitutional, but he thought that if you put the properly worded declaration here, that the British would back down. But they decided that including everything would be pushing too far at this stage. And they're saying like they didn't actually totally ignore it. They're just saying that prior to that 7 Years' War, there was all kinds of stuff that violated our rights, but we want to keep things cool with you guys. Let's just address the most recent stuff. And they started out with this. Resolve that the following acts of Parliament are infringements and violations of the rights of the colonists, and that the repeal of them is essentially necessary in order to restore harmony between Great Britain and the American colonies. So they listed a bunch of them. You can actually do a web search on these, like 4 George III, Chapter 15. Once you start digging around, you'll learn what these phrases mean. So they basically listed things like the Sugar Act of 1764, the Currency Act, I think was also the same year in 1764, the Townshend Acts of 1767, all the Coercive Acts of 1774, and a bunch of other ones. And they summed it all up. So they went through all of these things, and they said, this is the stuff that you're doing. This is unconstitutional. It's illegal. And he said also that keeping a standing army in several of these colonies in time of peace without the consent of the legislature of that colony in which such army is kept is against law. What you're doing is illegal. It's got to stop. And to these grievous acts and measures, Americans cannot submit. The mentality that you have to submit and hope to convince government that government should stop doing what government was never supposed to do in the first place is the mentality of someone not living in a land of the free, but instead on their knees begging for permission. This was rejected. This idea of passive obedience and non-resistance was rejected as the number one threat to liberty by a number of the old revolutionaries, prominently James Otis Jr. So they thought it was essential when you violated the Constitution that the people had to defy it. They sum it up with this. We have for the present only, so they're saying we could do more, but for now, this is what we're going to do. We're going to pursue the following peaceable measures. 1, to enter into a non-importation, non-consumption, and non-exportation agreement or association. 2, to prepare an address to the people of Great Britain and a memorial to the inhabitants of British America. And 3, to prepare a loyal address to His Majesty, agreeable to resolutions already into. Now, they followed up the very next week, I think it was on the 20th, with the first of what we can call the Big Four founding documents, the Continental Association. This was the economic boycott of the British. This was a voluntary agreement that, in essence, put teeth into the proposals going back to Boston, the town meeting, May 13th, and then the Suffolk resolves, and of course a few others in between. But it was a voluntary agreement that put teeth into this Declaration resolves of the First Continental Congress by formalizing this coordinated economic embargo against the British. Now, I feel like I say this every single episode, but I never learned any of this stuff in government-run schools. I don't know about you. Maybe I was one of these people who was just not paying attention. I mean, I know partly that was part of the case, but we really did not get into these essential foundational principles. I'm sure a lot of other people are not learning about this either, and that's why we spend so much time. We work so hard every single day to get this kind of information out to more and more people, and nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. No pressure. We're going to continue doing this over and over and over. We got over 10,000 articles and blogs on our website at 10thamendmentcenter.com. We're going to continue doing this, but if you are financially capable of helping us out, again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, I'd be extremely grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us today. Again, I really appreciate you being here. There's a few free, easy peasy things you can do to help us spread the word as well. Smash the like button, subscribe, leave reviews on Apple Podcasts, all that other good stuff that can help trigger algorithms of the platforms and tell them to show us to more people. Thank you so much for watching the show. I hope you enjoy this information as much as I enjoyed putting it together and sharing it with you. I hope you had a great weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next time here on the Path to Liberty.